Welcome. My name is Alyson Rae Demirdjan, and I'm excited to present my work, Closing the Gap, Syncretic Stewardship in an Age of Inequality. This is going to be the social, environmental, business, and economic case for fashion subsidization. So the agenda for today, this is going to be an introduction, an overview of research concept, significance, literature review, part one, where I will define syncretic stewardship and outline its main challenges. And then part two is subsidy theory. And then the research concept, where I have the social, environmental, and business and economic case. And then the conclusions with the limitations and future research agenda, and of course, acknowledgements. So we are living in an age of inequality, which is being exacerbated by climate change, which is, of course, also posed to impact more socially vulnerable people first, especially in the global South. So in the US, income inequality has actually increased by 39% since 1980, whereas now the top 1% own more than 1/3 of US wealth. The global fashion industry perpetuates both. It's a social and environmental emergency. For instance, of the entire GHG emissions in 2020, 24% were from industry, whereas up to 10% was specifically from the fashion sector. Fashion must be reinvented. However, sustainable and socially responsible fashion, SSR, faces many hurdles. So global leaders have been starting to discuss the need for incentives to encourage sustainable production and consumption. So the overview of my research concept is this is a policy proposal for the subsidization of the sustainable and socially responsible sector of the fashion industry for the pursuit of economic equity and environmental justice, because in short, fashion shouldn't cost the earth. The significance is that cheap, fast fashions are overconsumed while expensive SSR fashions are underconsumed, even though most Americans believe and are worried about climate change. This represents the green attitude behavior gap. So this table demonstrates the differences between these two types of fashion, but this research specifically focuses on the price gap because luxury prices for SSR fashion actually highlight economic and racial inequalities of domestic fashion consumerism. So a brief bit about the literature review. So defining syncretic stewardship. So achieving syncretic stewardship is the integration of the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit into a firm's business strategies and operations in a transparent and accountable manner. This is a holistic model of corporate social responsibility that establishes best practices. But there are three challenges in attaining syncretic stewardship, especially in an age of inequality. So first, there are consumption challenges, where mainly it's price sensitivity in consumers. Nearly half of all American workers earn less than $30,000 a year. So in short, this means that environmental benevolence or the adoption of green living is simply not immune to the phenomenon of inequality. So inequality acts as a barrier to green consumption. Next, there are two main manufacturing challenges. First, of course, CSR does not always make business sense. Integrating CSR can be very risky, and business sustainability could be jeopardized, especially if high prices shrink a firm's consumer market. This is also because novel manufacturing methods and design principles often add extra costs that can reduce the firm's value in terms of revenue. The next big challenge is that environmental stewardship requires complex actions that require capital and resources in order to, for instance, maintain farming and soil health, water quality, deforestation, and the big one, which is, of course, decarbonizing the supply chain and reaching net zero. Last, there are societal challenges. We struggle with capitalism because American society adheres to these capitalistic principles of infinite economic growth, but this is of course not sustainable because the earth has ecological limits, so economies must instead develop. The concept of degrowth challenges these ideas of capitalism. So degrowth then requires a reevaluation of society's priorities and reordering our values. So global leaders are now calling on consumers to buy less and for companies to produce less. This is also because fast fashion only seeks to maximize profits regardless of social and environmental costs. So challenge-led policies, as is my policy proposal, that address complex social and environmental issues, as well as the idea of degrowth, actually can be effective if they aim to shape markets in order to reach societally agreed targets driven by public purpose. So part 2, subsidy theory. This research puts forth subsidy theory, which is an accumulation of multiple theories as well as the historical context for subsidy deployment. So briefly going over the definition and purpose of a subsidy, I pulled multiple definitions in order to kind of figure out what exactly the scope would be. So mainly they are a financial contribution by a government or any public body given to businesses, individuals, or even nonprofits, but it really must confer a benefit. This research goes into cash grants and vouchers as a form of income and market price support. So another way of looking at this is that subsidies keep prices low for consumers and higher for producers and can reduce costs for both. It can also be defined in terms of minimum standards of consumption because subsidizing commodities make it easier for lower income groups and marginalized groups to be able to afford something. So it balances consumption asymmetries and creates equity. So subsidies in this research, cash grants, a direct transfer of funds, but the eligible guarantee must meet certain criteria. Vouchers are certificates or coupons from a government agency for qualifying individuals. They redistribute economic power between producers and consumers through increasing purchasing power. So it changes the funding scheme in the marketplace from supply to demand. Increased client choice and expanded competition can also create positive changes in the marketplace, including improvements in price, supply, quality, innovation, and even client satisfaction. And interestingly, despite the fact that vouchers are highly successful, especially in the US, for instance, the food stamp program, their use is one of the least understood welfare reform proposals, so more empirical research really is needed. So the historical context. Subsidies are really a short-term and interventionist tool in order to stimulate and encourage nascent but crucial industries that are just vital to the economy and the collective national well-being. They really began in earnest in the 20th century with the fossil fuel subsidies to help recover initial investments, lower production costs, achieve scale, and incentivize new domestic energy sources, domestic kind of being one of the key points of this model. So in my paper, I discuss a Pigouvian framework for SSR fashion subsidies. You can read this in detail in the full paper, but basically the Pigouvian subsidy predicts that goods with positive externalities will be underconsumed, as is the case with SSR fashion. So these subsidies are meant to encourage green consumption, reduce production costs, and lower consumer-facing costs. And in short, really just reduce pollution, for instance, subsidies for solar panels, which then as a whole will enhance society. And in the case of fashion, it can help mitigate the impacts of climate change. You can also see a voucher framework in my full paper, as well as a case analysis that's actually really interesting between renewable energy subsidies, which could serve as a parallel for SSR fashion subsidies. So government intervention theory is one of the main theories that my work relies on. Today, governments will typically intervene for economic or social reasons to improve equity and the pursuit of social welfare, oftentimes through income redistribution. In terms of the fashion industry, government intervention should actually be harnessed to level the playing field. According to this report by the UK Parliament, policies and incentives actually really are needed to create a new economic model for the industry because sustainable fashion companies face a ton of extra costs and barriers in the marketplace compared to fast fashion. I also have an interventionist framework and historical context for government intervention in the full paper. Market failure theory is the next big one that my work relies on. So market failure theory describes the circumstance for government intervention to redistribute income and wealth and balance the market. So fast fashion does not factor negative externalities into prices, and that is why it's a market failure. It's similar to fossil fuels in that the price that consumers pay does not factor in the negative damage that it's doing to the planet. So this is really a supply and demand problem. SSR fashion is underconsumed while fast fashion is overconsumed. So intervention in this case to shape the market seeks to improve equity, societal welfare, and economic development. So now getting into my research concept, the case for SSR fashion subsidies. So closing the gap. So a framework has emerged in order to close the price gap and level the playing field for SSR fashion companies compared to fast fashion, which then in turn would close the green attitude behavior gap. So figure 3A demonstrates both types of gap, whereas the use of subsidies and incentives to divest from fast fashion can shift the balance of fashion in the marketplace and hopefully effectively closing the green attitude behavior gap. So the green wedge symbolizes the potential price range for SSR fashion as determined by the monetary amount of subsidies. So this paper really is a call to action. So my policy proposal includes upstream production subsidies, a top-down approach, in conjunction with downstream consumer-facing subsidies, a bottom-up approach. And importantly, the OECD recommends promoting sustainable production and consumption in order to achieve sustainable development. So producer subsidies are meant to improve business practices and environmental and social impacts, whereas consumer subsidies are meant to reduce social disparities and make green choices more affordable. They are also used to incentivize fashion companies to use more sustainable manufacturing methods and make their products more affordable to consumers. And these economic incentives may actually be key to solving different issues like factory conditions and shopping habits. So you can see how my top-down, bottom-up approach really is trying to address both of these issues. So here's my figure that kind of gives an overview of the different cases and why I do have this two-prong approach. Whereas so A, B, and C actually represents the three pillars of sustainability, the triple bottom line. So this figure goes with that last one, and you can see the full one in the paper. I'm going to go over it quickly now in the next couple of slides. But basically, as a summary, the social case is to reduce domestic and global inequality, close that price gap, which will then improve equity and accessibility. The environmental case is very straightforward: mitigate climate change and close that green attitude behavior gap. The business case is to support green industries and reduce business risks. And the economic case is to correct market failures and achieve sustainable development. So now getting into more specifics of these different cases. So upstream subsidies are meant to integrate CSR and social responsibility. And it's been shown that upstream production subsidies can reduce regional and individual inequality. So for instance, SSR subsidization could improve quality of life for supply chain workers while keeping retail prices competitive. So for instance, it's actually estimated that only about 2% of workers in the fashion value chain make a living wage. Next would be to decolonize fashion and dismantle the current system and reorient these power structures between the West and the global South, whereas currently corporations are effectively agents of exploitation. So integrating CSR will help decolonize fashion. So downstream domestic subsidies are going to reduce inequality in a different way. So in the US, we have legislated economic and racial inequality. So what I mean by legislated is that we have economic, gender, and racial inequality, which is the result of discriminatory economic policies. For instance, it could be tax cuts and corporate loopholes for the wealthy alongside simultaneous cuts to welfare programs that help low-income and marginalized groups. Another big issue is the federal minimum wage, which is still at $7.25 and has not kept up with the cost of living since 1960. This is because also past US presidents have been largely unwilling to update these metrics due to political calculations, mainly that increasing the poverty threshold would give the appearance of an increase in poverty, where that's obviously not the case. Wage laws now then keep people in poverty, and really 62% of jobs do not even support middle-class life once you account for the cost of living. But racial inequality is another big issue when it comes to SSR fashion. Of course, America's ties to slavery has created a wealth gap, but really it's institutional racial inequality that keeps the gap alive. So 21% of African Americans actually live below the poverty threshold. So consider this in relation to the price point for eco-fashion. Inequality prevents these groups from participating in green living. So inequality reinforces these power structures that prevent green consumption. So really inequality causes the green attitude behavior gap, and which makes SSR fashion kind of a luxury commodity. So fashion subsidization could instead level this playing field to make purchasing green goods more acceptable. The environmental case, again, is very straightforward: help companies achieve syncretic stewardship. Right now, the fashion industry is on track to miss that 1.5C target by 50%. And right now, corporations simply can't be trusted to self-regulate. So we really do need government intervention in the fashion sector to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. Upstream subsidies also seek to reduce environmental injustice. The Human Rights Council recently announced that having a clean and healthy environment is a human right. So ending these degrading business practices would reduce this environmental injustice, especially for the global South. For consumers, it's really about fixing how they value things. So right now, inequality creates low environmental valuation. For instance, purchasing fast fashion despite having green concerns in conjunction with high environmental degradation, which is fast fashion production. Then it seeks to incentivize green behavior. Subsidies could close the price gap, incentivize green consumption, help SSR fashion become mainstream, and spur fast fashion divestment. The business case is that companies face business risks. So SSR fashion must make commercial sense. So businesses need assurances because being good doesn't always pay. So SSR subsidies would reduce production costs, provide funding, which is currently at a 60-year low, reduce greenwashing. Mainstreaming CSR would reduce the need for greenwashing marketing tactics, and government oversight would signal to consumers responsible business practices. And then, of course, CSR will improve brand reputation. So here's my figure for closing the price gap and really why I have this two-pronged approach. We want to reduce production costs and increase consumer purchasing power at the same time. The economic case is to stimulate a global industry. Fashion is a great economic force. It's 2% of the world's GDP, employs 300 million workers, and is really crucial for countries, developing countries. Strategic subsidies have been shown to be optimal from a global perspective. So SSR fashion subsidization would, in fact, encourage this global powerhouse and push it towards a green economy. There's also potential for domestic job creation, potentially maybe reshoring some apparel jobs and spurring economic development. And then green citizenry, encouraging green consumption, balancing these consumption asymmetries. Increasing purchasing power has been shown to be the best method of creating economic stability. So hopefully downstream SSR subsidies could reward green citizenry and again, create a more sustainable future. So briefly, some conclusions. This is a fashion-targeted climate policy. Radical change is needed to move environmental stewardship to being part of the business process. Right now, we're at a critical inflection point for the fashion industry to align with these global ambitions to curb climate change. So there is potential for this challenge-led policy to shape the market and address these social and environmental issues driven by public purpose. So this research has laid out the social, environmental, business, and economic case for fashion subsidization, and SSR fashion Peruvian subsidy should be considered as it may facilitate a turning point for brands being able to achieve syncretic stewardship in an age of inequality. The main limitation is overcoming political gridlock in the American system of government. The future research agenda. This could be adopted for a global scale since the fashion industry is a global policy or a global industry. We could also develop a policy framework for upstream production subsidies because, as I noted, this research really only explored a voucher framework. I also hope to use GIS mapping to demonstrate SSR fashion's geographical accessibility problem. Also, case analysis on upstream subsidies in regards to the ability to address inequality and environmental injustice, exploring subsidy funding sources that also really excites me, and then expand on ways to include incentivizing the middle and upper classes to also divest from fast fashion. I want to just quickly acknowledge that this research was supported by Associate Professor Shang Liu and Distinguished Professor John Byrne from the University of Delaware. And I am actually looking for future collaborators. So if this research interests or excites you, I would love to connect.